we're not in a community. I mean, you could say Aristotle would have tons to say about the political state of the United States right now. And one of the things I think he would point out is that the reason there's a lot of discomfort and dissatisfaction politically is because actually what we have is not a singular community. We have different and often incommensurate conceptions of the good that we're acting for.
Welcome to the Acton Line Podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Daniel Wagner, associate professor and chair of philosophy at Aquinas College, sits down with Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and research associate, to explore the Aristotelian-Thomistic account of the human good, natural law, and living well. Why should we seek to know ourselves? How is the human good related to excellence or virtue? How do we reconcile this account of the good with the divergent moral views we often see in the real world? You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Daniel Wagner, associate professor and chair of philosophy at Aquinas College. His research interests include philosophy of nature and science, metaphysics, philosophical anthropology, the principles of ethics in both St. Thomas and Aristotle, phenomenology in Edmund Husserl and Karol Wojtyla, and the history of philosophy. His Ph.D. dissertation focused on the Aristotelian foundations of the human good. Today, we'll be discussing the Aristotelian-Thomistic account of the human good, natural law, and living well. Daniel, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So the Western philosophical tradition sort of begins with Socrates, and at the Oracle of Delphi, he's commended to know himself. And I'm wondering why we should seek to know ourselves. What's the upside? You know, we have all sorts of responsibilities, obligations in our lives. We're busy people. There's a lot of Netflix. So what is it about knowing ourselves that is rewarding?
Great question. Note thee say auton, know thyself. Yes, Socrates busied himself trying to answer that question. Why does it matter? I think the first thing is just to point out that we're stuck with it. We're stuck with that inquiry. If you look at other animals and their behavior, they appear to act by instinct for the ends that they seek. And if those ends are present, they tend to be successful and to flourish as species, right? When those ends disappear, we assume because they're not rational agents, they can't give a scientific account of what's good for them, and they can't seek, alternative courses of actions. They tend to have problems, and things like extinction happen. The human being, the human person, comes to be not merely with sense-perceptive awareness of the environment and attraction and repulsion to things in the environment. We also relate to things knowing them in themselves, and we also are an object of knowing for ourselves. So the key thing is we have to figure out what's good for us and how to behave and act. And supposedly there's a good way for us to behave and act, one that would make us successful and flourish. And there are ways in which that wouldn't be conducive to that end. So I guess my initial answer would be we're kind of stuck with this inquiry and this puzzle. We have to do it.
Yeah. And we have these organs of action, these faculties that we end up using. Making our way through because we're stuck with this. We end up not operating on instinct. There is sort of like a deliberative process that we can avoid. What is the relationship between our sort of powers and faculties of reason, of action, and ourselves? What do they tell us about ourselves?
Yeah, great question. So, our faculties and powers constitute what we are. And on the Platonic, generally speaking, Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian model, faculties or powers are a relation between, you could say a formal constituency and an object. So classic example would be, the eye it's an organ, it's a part that we understand as existing in relation to a distinct object, which is make color and shape, present to our awareness in sense perception. Okay, so you can see there. I call this, following William Wallace, The Philosophy of Nature and Science, a power-object model of defining. Right. So what we've done here is, if I ask what is an eye, we understand you don't really know what an eye is unless you can explain it in terms of this power in relation to this object, if that makes sense. The model is teleological. In other words, the Greek term telos means end, perfection, completion. Okay, so the idea here is that the eye as an organ doesn't come to be for no reason. It has an end and a goal, which is to perform this functional action, make color and shape present to our awareness. Now, that can be done well or it can be done poorly.
And this is where virtue comes in. Yes. with the use of our faculties and actions. Can you unpack that a little bit? What is it to do these things well? We talk about virtue. Oftentimes we talk about it. We just conflate it with morals of just like, the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do in a general sense. But you're saying it's related to particular ends. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I'm using the eye as a kind of example. They also, like Aristotle and Plato, like the craft analogy. So the when you define carpentering, right? It's an activity ordered towards a distinct end and goal, which is the production of home for the sake of shelter and protection for some individual or individuals. Once we have analytically defined a term like that in relation to its proper end or goal, we are capable of making value claims, right? So once you know what a carpenter is or an eye, you can make claims about, first of all, good and bad eyes in the sense of, operative and non-operative to one degree or another, and the same thing with carpenters. You can also make claims about things that are good or bad relative to those ends and goals. So, like, for example, overconsumption of caffeine is something that is bad relative to the end or object of sight, because it does something with the eye pressure, which causes us to have blurry vision. Okay, so you could say, in a sense, now the eye isn't morally bad when that happens, right? Yeah. But there's a sense of what's good and bad in terms of what's beneficial and what's harmful already built in to the nature of the eye, if you will, and you can see that with the craft analogy too. And the idea here is that the human person is like this also as a whole, that we are ordered. It's not just that we have particular organs like the eye ordered towards proper ends or objects, but also the whole person is constituted by a set of essential faculties that are determined by nature towards specific ends or goods. And now suddenly we can talk about how those faculties, obtaining those ends is good or not is bad. And we can talk about things that are good or bad relative to the exercise of those faculty. Now, you asked me about virtue.
Yeah.
So virtue comes into play. What is virtue? Well, virtue is a disposition that allows the human agent to obtain that proper end, object, or goal. So I like sports analogies.
Yeah.
So a good one here is if you think about the athlete, say a golfer or a basketball player, right? There's the theory of this practice. What it means to play golf well, is to get the ball into the hole in a certain number of shots, or to play basketball well is to score in various ways and prevent the other team from scoring. Okay, and you want that good when you're ordered towards that end and good qua athlete. But you can't achieve that end or goal without first establishing the habits, the dispositions that allow you to achieve that end or goal. So you need to practice basketball or golf. And what is this? It's you taking on muscle memory. There's a lot you could say, contemporaries would say about the formation of neural patterns, okay, but it's also the formation of intellectual habits, understanding the nature of the game and its goal and how I need to exercise my body in order to obtain that end and goal. So this is the idea of, when you think about virtues are then dispositions, habits that we take on so that we can obtain the end and the good. The eye, again, there are kind of natural correlates here. With the eye is another good example. You can, if you don't exercise the eye, those of us that spend a lot of time staring at books or computer screens, when we don't use our eyes, the depth perceptive function, right, it can actually weaken. You can strengthen it again by going outside and focusing and exercising your eyes to some degree or another. So that's a helpful kind of analogy also.
Yeah. So one of the virtues of point guards is court awareness. You have these habits, these dispositions that enable you to have excellence or mastery over,
Yeah. So I always joke, like, what's the difference between, Wagner, me, and Steph Curry? Let's assume that I was in the same physical shape that he is, which I'm not, of course. But let's just assume that for the sake of the example here. The difference is Steph Curry has put in years and years and years and years of practice to form these dispositions and habits so that he can, drain 3-point shots at an incredible level. Of course, I can't do that. So even if I were physically the same, you'd see there'd be a difference between us in terms of acquired habits or virtues in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this account depends on sort of like a particular role that definitions play. And there's some historical sort of criticisms of that sort of account of the human good. What are some of those objections, and how does somebody deal with those from an Aristotelian-Thomistic perspective?
Yeah, and maybe we should just say, give the general sketch here in Aristotle and St. Thomas in terms of natural virtue is that that what we are, the capacities that are essential are our animal and our intellectual or spiritual capacities, and that those can be exercised well or poorly. So we have a set of virtues, principally, you have wisdom, temperance, fortitude, justice, etc. And these are dispositions we need to take on in order to achieve our individual goods and collectively in a community. So that's kind of the account that we're talking about, that you find built in Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. The challenge to it, I think, I start with Occam in the late 1200s, who, as a logician that wasn't engaged in any kind of empirical science like Aristotle was, so he was kind of up in a tower. Yeah. He criticized the notion that we could define things, period, right? So he doesn't believe that there are natures or forms immanent in particular things in the world that are common and that we could know those as common natures, or in other words, universal definitions. So the position is called nominalism. It's an epistemological theory, theory of knowledge that says definitions are not possible for us to obtain. So that's obviously going to be a big problem. If I can't set out an account of the human person in universal terms, that we're animals, that we're intellectual, if I can't do that kind of analytic work I did with the carpenter and the eye, I'm not going to be able to make claims about particular humans by applying that definition, if that makes sense.
Okay, so this is an account that, you might be able to know your eyes, or you might be able to know that dog, but you're really limited to just that under this account, is that you can't take it back to that next level of abstraction.
Exactly. And of course, if you're trying to gain objectivity, so on that Aristotelian approach, you can see objective claims become apparent pretty quickly if all human beings are ordered towards these ends, the exercise of the animal and intellectual capacities in a certain way. It's clear that it's good for them to achieve that just in analytic terms, but it's also clear that there's a whole set of things that you can say are bad universally. I mean, if it's good for me to exercise my animal capacities well, right, like say athletically, then it's also clear that it would be harmful for me to be deprived of the necessary conditions for that to me. So, for example, proper nutrients, shelter, etc. And that's going to be universally true for all humans in all places at all times. You could say a similar thing about a really good example is the need for leisure in order to exercise the mind, right? That and to obtain that virtue and excellence. Well, you can't do that if you don't have time beyond work for meeting, the necessary conditions for survival. So, there you can see the objectivity through the application of the universal definition. So you deny the universal definition that we can do that. And by the way, I mean, oftentimes philosophers, including Occam, don't see the consequences of their principles or suppositions. And this is probably a case of that, where there isn't an awareness that this is going to result in an undermining of what we're talking about: virtue ethics, natural law theory. If that makes it, did I answer you?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a way, we're talking a little bit here about sort of the biological, but there's also a sort of moral account of the good. And one objection to this might be, we encounter a wide array of differing, sometimes conflicting accounts of the moral good. And if there is this shared common sense of what it is to be a person, then why isn't there this shared common sense of the moral good?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, I mean, that might, in a way, that goes back to your first question, which implies this point that we don't necessarily to say that there is a human good, objectively speaking, isn't the same as to say everybody knows it per se and is acting for it. So, right in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, what does he do? I mean, he starts off by defining the good as that which everyone seeks. It's the ultimate. It's the end. There has to be one. Psychologically, conceptually, he says, or we can't behave, or we can't act, which is an interesting point. But then everybody says it's happiness, eudaimonia, but the question then is, well, what is happiness, right? And he goes through the list. Some people say it's the possession of wealth. Some people say it's physical pleasure. Some really crazy people say it's the pursuit of wisdom. It's honor. It's political power. Which one is it? So clearly, to say there's an end, a good, objectively speaking, isn't to say everyone knows what it is. That would be my answer as to why there is, let's just say, pluralism. People have different conceptions of what the good is, and they're acting according to those, if that makes sense. So, I mean, but my first response would be to that as an objection would be, the fact that people aren't aware of what's really good, and that they have a conception of what's good, but it's only apparent, doesn't mean there isn't a true good, and that we ought not to act for it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and it's interesting as you were unpacking this, I'm thinking, we don't expect everybody to have an account of, let's say, the way that electric circuits work. Like some people very clearly do, electricians do, but it doesn't surprise us that other people, despite the fact that, all of this obeys sort of physical laws, the fact that not everyone, those aren't equally readily apparent to everyone doesn't seem to surprise us in that way. But when we unpack it in terms of the human good, we tend to be more ill at ease with that pluralism than we do with other forms of knowledge.
Yeah. Yes. Why do you think that is?
It might be because there's more diversity among those we consider experts. There's a larger consensus among electrical engineers about how these systems work than there is in faculties of philosophy.
Right. Very true. Very true. So how do we respond to that? I mean, first of all, Aristotle thinks, so does Plato, that hoi polloi are in a state of confusion. They probably tell you they're happy. They tend towards hedonism. They think that really the only good is physical pleasure. They're confused about this. I mean, so the initial response is to say, yeah, but if you look at your faculties and their intrinsic order towards these objects, it's still the case that objectively speaking, you're not obtaining what is good and beneficial for you. Now, whether or not Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, they're all going to say that when you see this intellectually, so if we go down the road of me expressing to you in the Agora that there's more to life than just eating sweet pastries, that the exercise of your mind is essential to your flourishing, and by the way, maybe that's why you feel dissatisfied, right? If we go down that line, you'll want it when you apprehend it intellectually, but it's very likely that you'll only want it in kind of a second order way because you've formed a set of habits. So this is why education is so important. You've formed a set of habits for acting for what you thought was good, but turns out to be only apparently good, right? And so the fact that, Plato or Aristotle convinces you intellectually that there's more to life than the hedonist way isn't sufficient for you changing your ways or even verbally agreeing or consenting. And that's the standard response, is to become angry, right?
And we have more opportunities because we're all striving after the good all of the time. And oftentimes we're striving wrongly. And as a result, all of us come into these sort of moral questions with considerably more baggage than we would in terms of like approaching a circuit. Like we have our own poor habits, our own vices, our own things. So by this account, one would expect, in fact, because this is an activity that we're constantly engaged in, many of us not well prepared to face it. I mean, this is the need for education, that we come to these questions with poorer habits of mind than we would, necessarily with other disciplines like geology, where you're often, people come at that pretty fresh into an educational environment. They might have some questions about rocks. They've seen rocks in the world. They know they're hard, but in a way they're more teachable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to follow up on that a little, I mean, so, I thinking of my own personal experience, I've never seen, a fight break out at a Thanksgiving dinner or anything like that over the theoretical meaning of triangle, right? And the reason for that is there aren't immediate practical ramifications, okay, if we disagree about that, okay? But if we get in a debate about what is good for us, and the line of reasoning takes me to a place, I'll just stick with the same example, where it means that I'm less than I'm supposed to be, right? That I ought to be, say, exercising my intellect, or that I have obligations to my family and friends that I'm not meeting, right? Now, these things require actual life changes, right? And that means they require suffering. to achieve the good. If I'm wrong, I'm going to have to change how I live my own life. So there's nothing at stake with pure theoretical inquiries like geology, and so we're not worried about that. We don't flee from Socrates, but Socrates is scary because he might take you down a road where you come to see intellectually that there are courses of action that you ought to be engaged in. And that might make one angry if one is not predisposed or doesn't make an effort to be open and to change. So there's great passages about this, by the way, in Plato's Phaedo on dialogue and the need for a kind of openness like this. But I do think you hit an important point here. The philosophical attitude consequently is a radical one because you do have to put yourself in a place, if you're going to engage in inquiry about the truth, about the good, where you're willing to – this requires courage because it might require that you change, right? And that's a scary thing to change.
So we have this account of human nature, and we have this open invitation to inquiry in the human good that's sort of necessary to discern it on a practical level. And that needs to be grounded in a sort of practice of virtue in order to sort of get us to the good. How do we reason from an account of, let's say, the human good, the good for, let's say an individual, to the good of the community? Because individual human goods often conflict. Yes. And how do we go from an account of the human good to maybe one way to talk about it is to talk about it in terms of social good or social justice.
Right. Yes.
How do you get from that account of human good to the common good of all that all people share?
Yeah. Great question. And maybe we should go back a little to one of the other key interlocutors and objectors in the history of philosophy. The after Occam in the modern period, most of the moderns accepted Occam's view on definition. Mm-hmm. Okay, and my answer is going to involve appealing to definition again.
Yeah.
Hume is famous for denying that we can do this kind of reasoning, that we can go from what something is to what's good for it. There's some misconceptions about Hume's own project. McIntyre has done good work on this, showing actually Hume does think there's a way to talk about what's good and bad by looking at human nature. Mm-hmm. But the key is he reduces human nature in the moral sphere to sentiments or mere preferences in terms of attraction and desire, which essentially can be arbitrary, right? So it can differ from individual to individual. So it terminates in kind of subjectivism and relativism in terms of ethics and morality. So how then can we get from, say, an account of a human being to an account of and the good of the human being to an account of what's good for a collective of human beings is the kind of question. And especially keeping in mind that we do tend now to think, I think, in Humean terms culturally, in emotivist terms. So how do we respond to that? So again, I'm going to start by following Aristotle here by defining human beings as, I'm just going to say, rational animals, okay? Mm-hmm. And explain that when you look at the individual human being, saying that the individual human being is a rational animal is to say that this person has these faculties, powers, which, like the eye or like the carpenter, are ordered to distinct ends, okay, goods. Yep. That is the good exercise of these capacities or powers. I think the key thing we have to do is why will people be skeptical of applying that? Now, look, if I get you to accept that, okay, and say here's a collective of human beings, a city, where we're acting socially, what is the common good? And I like that you brought justice up. So Book 5, the Nicomachean Ethics, justice in general is the relation between individuals where they're giving each other what's due. What is due is that they act virtuously together, thus achieving. So the collective good is the collective expression of the individual goods of each person, which is them expressing their virtues, which is also to achieve happiness and so on. Now, that account, I think, is robust, and you'll accept it as long as you accept that all of these individuals possess this nature ordered towards this end and this good. Does that seem fair to you?
Yeah, no. What I'm thinking, so there is, at sort of like a base level, so if there is a sense in which each of us should be ordered to our own good, we require the sort of social space in order to make that possible. So, I cannot, attain my own good. I cannot attain my own sort of ends in a world in which, say, there's endemic violence and there's always, a threat to my person. That's a world in which I cannot realize the good when that might be frustrated. And this goes back. Aristotle also talks about how we're intrinsically social animals for this reason. We sort of need each other at some sort of baseline to even realize our individual ends. Now, is there more to it than that? You'll often have people, and I'm thinking, contemporary critics of sort of like liberalism, will talk about how we're too much focused on the individual today, that there are goods beyond the goods of any individual person. Is that a fair critique? And in what ways are there so, and if so, what are the sort of social goods, what parts of the common good might be in tension with our individual goods, or is that a false dichotomy?
Yeah, that's a great, so I do agree that we tend towards a kind of individualism now, and that is really, it's not compatible with, I think, especially the approach that Aristotle's taking, but also Plato. Both of them hold, as he said, that we come together it's not contrary to our nature. There's kind of this ancient debate, right, that already pops up in the pre-Socratics. There was a sophist named Antiphon who held that cities, law, and justice, they come to be not as a result of nature, but contrary to nature, because effectively we're all egoists. We're only concerned with our own self-interested goods. Okay, we agree to enter the city, right? Because I know that if I try to act like a tyrant and obtain what I want, I'm probably going to get ganged up on, and I'm also a smaller guy, so it's not going to work out very well when I go up against those bigger humans, right? So I give up. This is also Hobbesian, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I give up, what I want by nature, which is really to control and subjugate everyone else, and have what I want whenever I want it in terms of physical pleasure. And I give that up and I enter the city. So justice is me abiding by the laws, which are actually restraining me from what I'm really tending towards as an individual. Yeah. You oppose that to there's some passages from a text called the Anonymous Iamblichus. We don't know who wrote it, which also parallels Plato. If you read the Republic, especially Book 2, right, where they point out what you said earlier, which is no. If you look at the city and law and justice, it appears that we come together because we are ordered towards each other in the sense that we cannot obtain our good without one another. And the division of labor makes this clear, just in a very simple materialistic way. It's not possible for me as an individual to provide all the material goods that I need, right? If I'm a shoemaker, I'm not going to be able to farm or be a carpenter, or you could update it and say build cars or whatever. So, so we're in a situation where we need each other. Aristotle focuses on, I think quite brilliantly at the beginning of the Politics, on the fact that our existence you can see the need for existence in the coupling of male and female, right? So that the species can't exist unless we come together. So we come together by nature, we form a basic unit, the family, then you get multiple families, a kind of tribe, and eventually you get a city. Justice then is in that city is the situation where we all relate to each other such that we obtain our good. That's those faculties expressing virtue, okay? And there's a set of things that we are obligated to do and to not do. Here's the key thing in terms of logical necessity, on the supposition or the condition that we're to obtain our good. And our good is communal. My good is your good, and your good is my good. So I think justice is the key concept here. So on the condition that we're all to flourish, which is this objective state of goodness that we're talking about, the perfection of our capacities by nature, then there's a set of behaviors we have to engage in, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know if that helps. I mean, the virtue of friendship is obviously something that is relevant to the question you're asking.
So this gets back, at the Acton Institute, we talk about how we want a free and virtuous society, and we believe those things are fundamentally compatible in a way that many folks do not. For instance, I'm thinking of Sigmund Freud and Civilization and its Discontents. For Freud, part of what being the city is not only do you constrain, but you create discontents. You create people for whom they cannot realize the good. Like civilization itself, at least for some people, is necessarily exclusionary. Whereas in a model in which, if you, rightly ordered, I guess you could say, there is no conflict between the individual good and the social good, because they are meshed together. Yep, yes. They are identical.
Yeah, in a sense, I think that's right. I think that's the perspective of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas in terms of natural virtue and the natural human good. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful.
Yeah. So I mean, I like the way of putting it. Putting it in those terms that to say that we're communal by nature is to say that by nature I am ordered towards your good and you are ordered towards my good. And that's not incompatible with being ordered towards my good simultaneously. Yeah. If that makes sense. There's no incompatibility. And friendship is a good example of that. Is the friend is the one that I trust precisely because I know the friend isn't just out for his or her own selfish interests, right? They actually are concerned with what's good for me also, which is why I would trust them.
Yeah. There's a great it's interesting. There's a whole piece my colleague Dylan Pauman wrote for the Journal of Markets and Morality on I think it's 6 conflicting views of self-interest among economists historically, because that's not a unified account. Right. It changes quite differently. But in the broadest sense, self-interest is the interests of the self, and the interests of the self include interests for others.
Yes.
And that I think that broad account of self-interest that you find among some, but not all economists, I think is compatible with this Aristotelian-Thomistic account.
Yes.
There are all sorts of, Smith is one of those folks that I think this resonates with. Okay. With Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat also wrote a book called Economic Harmonies. Okay. In which he talks about, fundamentally social organization need not be conflict oriented. Right. That there is a way in which we can all work towards each other's goods. And in fact, that's necessary for us to have a true civilization in any sense of the word.
Indeed. Yes, that's Plato. That's Aristotle. I mean, Plato, of course, in the Republic, Plato refers to justice, which, as a state where each member of society is obtaining what's good, and so the good is obtained collectively as a harmony, right? Where the virtues are all possessed. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So as we're sort of wrapping this up, now this is like an interesting intellectual exercise. Yeah. This is, I think, a very compelling argument. I think a lot of people they're confused about what nature is. They're confused about these sorts of things. But I think when you actually return to this tradition and you pay careful attention, this is a very compelling account of both the human good and the common good. How can this philosophical account, which makes sense of a tremendous amount of things, how can it help us, to paraphrase Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, to both be excellent and to be excellent to each other?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think there we look at the current state of things, and we see that we do have a pluralist society, people with different views of morality and the human good. And sometimes those are compatible. Sometimes they come into conflict, and they're not. They really can't coexist. And those are the more heated, and nasty debates we get in. I guess as a philosopher, the question I want to ask is why the attraction to theories that are antithetical to the virtue ethics model that we just went through. Why are people attracted to the notion that what's good for me is not the same as what's good for you? That morality is something constructed in the mind or contrived. And I think, well, I'll ask you, what do you think about that? Why are people? Because I think it's important to understand. There's an attraction. I can't promote this theory, which I think, like you said, I think it's true and it's valuable. I can't promote it unless I understand kind of what's the psychology behind. Why are people attracted to relativism and motivism?
So one way to think about it, and this is to go back to Freud, and Civilization and Its Contents is just a book that's been fascinating to me forever. And one of the temptations, one of the reasons that I think it's seductive is you have an account where you're like, oh, there are like problem people in society. Well, there's always going to be that. That like there's a way in which an account where you can devalue and dismiss other people, or to write them off and to say, these are the eggs that we as a society had to break in order to make the omelet. And if you take that sort of perspective, there are all sorts of social problems. You could say, oh, this isn't really social problems. This is just the nature of society. Right. And whereas if you have an account, a robust account of the common good, then you have to take a hard look at things and be like, well, this isn't working, and there are things we can do better. And in particular, there are also always things that I can do better, and that I am in, and that it's a way it implicates you, is that you are a responsible person here. In a way that I think other accounts, you don't have to embrace that responsibility. And the same is true on an individual level. And we talked about this earlier in terms of, if I have a notion of what's good for somebody and it differs from somebody else's account, that's a recipe for conflict, because there is insecurity there, there is vice, there is sensitivity, prickliness. People don't, on an individual level, like being criticized in general. So that might be another obstacle, like on an individual level, is this always calls for a constant sort of interrogation of the self and an interrogation of our social world in a way that is very discomforting in a lot of senses.
Okay, yeah, that I love that. I think that's the key that I see is we're not attracted to theories for no reason. There's some good that we're obtaining by being relativists, say, okay, or emotivists. I think that is one of the goods that we perceive, is that it allows us, I think we think it allows us to get along in a community. Actually, that's not quite right, because just to the extent that we disagree, this is where Aristotle, I think, can be very helpful, just to the extent that we disagree about the good and the common good, we're not in a community. I mean, you could say Aristotle would have tons to say about the political state of the United States right now. And one of the things I think he would point out is that the reason there's a lot of discomfort and dissatisfaction politically is because actually what we have is not a singular community. We have different and often incommensurate conceptions of the good that we're acting for. So you say I'm a relativist because it allows us to kind of be in the same room together, because my morality is my morality and yours is yours. But here's a point to kind of motivate us, I think, to be attracted to an account like Aristotle's that has real objectivity. It doesn't the relativist emotivist approach doesn't help us when we're dealing with people that are actually in our community that we care about. So how helpful is it for me, say, if a good friend or a sibling comes to me and expresses, I'm going to engage in this behavior, which the American Medical Association still calls an eating disorder, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I know that it's going to damage my friend or my sister's body, okay, and cause irreparable harm, and I care about the person and don't want that for them, right? Yeah. There's some level of ignorance there, okay? In this particular case, so once we're in a community, which means I want what's good for you and you want what's good for me, does appealing to relativism or emotivism, subjectivism, does it help me? It doesn't. It's not going to help me deal with this problem, which is I want the good for this friend of mine, and we can't get it this way by appealing to this theory.
It helps you ignore the problem, though.
Yeah, sure.
It helps. I mean, this is the temptation. And the more that we talk about this, the more that what it allows is an abdication of responsibility. Because this is hard. I mean, the real life circumstances of, like a situation that you outlined, it's not as if there's a simple answer to getting someone to eat in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. If we had that simple answer, a lot of us would be a lot more healthy than we are. That involves practice, that involves the exercise of a number of different virtues. And it is a real struggle.
Right.
And but life is struggle.
right. I mean, and you could use them. I mean, I use substance abuse as a more, say it's a highly addictive and harmful substance like methamphetamines or something like that. My problem now, this won't work maybe with a sociopath. I won't be able to motivate that person. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of assuming an audience that still has basic levels of empathy, and that they do, in a sense. They can't escape from wanting the good of the people that are actually in their immediate communities. Then I want to point out, here's a reason to go back to an account like Aristotle's or St. Thomas Aquinas', because here's a problem that relativism can't help you with, or subjectivism, right? The problem is you are aware of the fact that, objectively speaking, the consumption of this substance is harmful to the person, physically, mentally, etc., right? And because you're in a community with so I'm not really saying in this case you ought to want the good of the other. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you already want the good of the other. Yeah. Okay, this is your brother or your sister or your mom or your dad or whatever, okay, one of your best friends. You can't escape from that. That's part of human nature. Relativism, subjectivism, they're not going to help you deal with that problem. How are you going to convince your friend that this is a harmful activity that he or she ought not to engage in? Well, Aristotle can show. Look, he can show you on his account that if you want to obtain what's good for you in terms of the expression of your virtuous excellencies and your capacities, then this activity, right, is antithetical to that, and that is the sense in which you ought not to engage in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
So there's so one of the ways that this sort of philosophical account of the good can help us is rhetorically, in making the case to others. Can this account help us make the case to ourselves for those things that we know that we need to, we might know on an abstract level. We might have this intuition, like we have intuitions of people who are close to us, who maybe, there's aspects of their lives that are in order to the good. We also pretty consistently have those intuitions about ourselves, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. I think most of the time rightly, because right. But how does this account help us engage in self-transformation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I should say personally, it's one of the things that motivated me to study philosophy as an undergraduate student was precisely that, an intrinsic desire to know myself and to better myself. So that's a real part of my experience. It can help us. I mean, a simple example, we are bound. I'll go back to this point I made earlier. We are bound when we apprehend what is good, okay, intellectually, there's always a sense in which we're going to want it, although that's not a sufficient condition for us acting on it, because we'd have conflicting habits or lack the resource, right? There's a lot of reasons that might not happen, okay? Like, for example, there's a lot of things that I want. I apprehend them as good intellectually that I can't do anymore because I'm a professor and a husband and a father. I can't, engage in outdoor and exercise activities like I was at one time, right? And there's a sense of regret there. I haven't done anything wrong, but it's not possible for me to do it. I still want it though, right? I see the good of it and I miss it. I wish I could get it back. So, this account, right, is an account that allows us to see what we are in terms of these our essential capacities as ordered towards our end and our good, and it can thus allow us to want and then act for things that will be the source of our own flourishing, happiness, and good. So I always use like simple example, like if once the dentist explains to one the point of say flossing or brushing one's teeth, right? You're not going to not be able to see the good that will follow from that as an animal that needs nutrition, okay? And you can see, this is a good thing for me to engage in. You will want it consequently. Now, will you form a habit of acting for it regularly? I don't know. That's up to you. It's a practice. You have to do it yourself, So this is a similar move, right? Is what Aristotle wants you to hear is in St. Thomas Aquinas, you have a set of capacities by nature, intellectual and animal, and that exercising them. Now, there's many ways in which they can be exercised so that you can be happy. You pick an essential part of a society, okay, where persons or classes of persons are performing, functions that are needed, and that's a way to fulfill yourself as a rational animal. I think Aristotle is helpful because he shows us this account, just like my toothbrushing, flossing example, and it's logically, I think, necessary in suppositional terms on the supposition that you're to obtain what is good for you by nature. Here are the set of activities that you would have to engage in well. And, I like to kind of, in terms of contemporary modern science, there's a movement in psychology called positive psychology. Seligman is one of the main figures. I find this very helpful, right? Because he and his students and other followers have shown very convincingly that empirically speaking, it's true that people who are happy in a psychological sense are people that are engaged in perfective, virtuous activities like this. So people that are unhappy, a common theme, as long as certain material conditions are met, right?
Yeah.
You got to have a certain you got to have certain needs met in terms of material goods, food, shelter, etc., security. But once those are met, that's not a sufficient condition for being. There are a lot of people that have material needs met and they're miserable.
Yeah.
A common factor there is that they're not engaged. Those that are not happy, they have latent potentiality, right? They're not engaged in exercising well, excellently, and expressing their inborn capacities. So I think that's how it can be helpful. I think there are a lot of people now in our culture, especially with the advent of passive forms of entertainment, the TV and the internet, where we know you're physically, chemically depressed effectively. Not that those things are inherently wrong. I love movies. You know what I'm saying? But we know that if we only engage those kinds of activities, it is a kind of recipe for feeling dissatisfied and being in a state of depression. And Aristotle has a lot to say to that. And Seligman does a good work showing that it turns out that people that are happy are those that are exercising the capacities they have. So
the invitation to inquiry ends with the sort of invitation to action.
Yes, I like that.
I love this. Thank you so much, Daniel. This has been an illuminating conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise, it was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line,